UK now, where thousands of nurses are staging their first ever national walkout. The countrywide strike is part of a bitter dispute with the government over pay. It ramps up pressure on already stretched hospitals at one of the busiest times of the year. An estimated 100,000 nurses are striking at 76 hospitals and health centres, cancelling around 70,000 appointments. It's the latest in a series of mass strikes in the UK this month. Earlier this week, thousands of rail workers and postal staff walked out in separate disputes. The nurses said it was a difficult decision to take, but they had no alternative.
We're here because this government has turned its back on nursing. And when they turn their back on nursing, they've turned their back on patients and they've turned their back on the NHS. I would love to say I was in negotiations with the government. They're refusing to negotiate with me. They bring me into a room, they tell me I can talk about anything but pay. They close their books, don't put an extra brown penny on the table, and they walk away and they turn their back on the profession.
I mean, it hasn't been an easy choice. You enter the nursing profession because you want to help people, care for people while they're unwell. But those who are unwell today, or those who are in need of care, are receiving that in the hospitals. They are staffed caring for those unwell patients.
We have to acknowledge that we're only here because we've been pushed to this. We have been pushed to this occasion right now of being on strike, and there will be further strikes. But we have to acknowledge that we aren't here by choice, and that we've not done this on an easy whim.
This is the right time to be striking because that's when the nurses choose to strike. This is what's wrong with the time. It's always inconvenient for everybody. It's inconvenient for the nurses, but you know, there's inflation. The NHS is under threat from this Tory government. This is the right time to strike. We need coordinated action across many different sectors, and I completely support the nurses in this.
Now let's cross over to London, where our Rise correspondent Laurie Laird is monitoring events. Good to see you, Laurie. So members of the NHS, one of the most venerated institutions in Britain, taking action with nurses walking off the job. Tell us more about why they're striking and how the hospitals are coping.
Yeah, let's reverse those. I'm understanding, I've spoken to a few doctors, Charles, and I understand that hospitals are doing reasonably well. They're coping reasonably well. As we heard from one of the nurses in the preceding piece, emergency care is still on. Life-saving care is still happening. Things like chemotherapy, dialysis. So doctors say that they are functioning reasonably well, not as good as they would have liked. But the nurses have been very, very canny about this. Only about half the NHS organizations where there was a majority of nurses who voted to strike have actually walked off the job. And I think that shows that nurses are very, very sensitive to public opinion. And public opinion, as far as I can tell, is with the nurses at this point. But I think they're keenly aware that if we have horror stories about people who don't survive, don't get life-saving treatment because of the strike, I think nurses are very aware that the tide can turn. What the issue on the table is pay. Now, the nurses are asking for a 19% pay rise. I think that is a bit fanciful. And that does sound like a very, very high number, Charles. But according to the OECD, which is a research organization, between 2006 and 2019, and these aren't recent numbers, granted, real inflation-adjusted pay for nurses fell by 6%. And of course, this is before inflation really revved up, so it is continuing to eat into salaries. The government has said that they're willing to entertain an increase in pay of £1,400 a head. So you got on a base of about £34,000 per annum. That's the average nurse's salary. So you can see that the sides are very, very far apart.
And this is the first time, isn't it, Laurie, that the Royal College of Nursing has balloted and asked its members to go on strike. And that tells us about how serious this has become. I mean, do you think nurses and the government can come to a resolution?
I mean, as I say, at the moment, Charles, the sides are very, very far apart. And I don't think that the government will be able to offer the 19% that nurses are looking for. As I say, public sympathy is to a certain extent with the nurses. They are planning to strike again on Tuesday. They say if their demands aren't met, that there will be more widespread strikes come January. Again, we'll see where public opinion takes us. But of course, when you have one side asking for 19%, the other side offering much less than 3%, there's some wide range in there for somebody to come to a conclusion. But, Charles, the government really needed to see this coming. One of the things that people in the UK say that they think is wrong with the country, not so much Brexit, not some of the things that we talk about every night on the news, they think that they're very worried about the state of the NHS. Vacancies for both doctors and nurses in the NHS are in, five figures. Tens of thousands of jobs are unfilled. This makes it very difficult for the government to clear waiting lists. So I think that the nurses at the moment probably have a pretty strong card to play.
Recall, Laurie, how during the pandemic nurses were risking their own lives, tending to people, saving lives, not seeing their own families, etc. And now they're being forced to take this action. We're going to be watching that very closely. But let's turn to the Bank of England. It's raised rates again. Does that complicate matters?
It does, Charles. It certainly means that any nurses, striking workers, all of us in the UK who may carry debt will have to pay quite a bit more to service this debt. But the Bank of England it's linked to the nurses in a way. Many public sector workers are striking in the UK. Postal workers are on strike today as well. Rail workers will go on strike tomorrow. And the Bank of England and the government have said, look, if we allow these pay rises to take effect, if we allow pay to keep up with inflation, that will continue to fuel inflation because that makes the services more expensive. So if a nurse is making a lot more money, or a hairdresser, anyone in the service sector, that price of that service goes up. That further fuels inflation, further fuels demands for wages. So the Bank of England and the government have said they do not want a wage price spiral, and that's one of the reasons the Bank of England lifted rates today by 0.5 percentage point. It's a smaller lift than they had done the last time around, which was 75 basis points. But the Bank of England didn't give us much of a sense of what their next move will be. 2 of the 9 members on the rate setting committee actually voted to keep rates unchanged, which suggests that they're quite concerned about the state of the economy.
And of course, Laurie, the Bank of England wasn't the only central bank in action this week. I mean, we saw the Fed in the US, and now we understand there could be higher rates here in Nigeria after the latest inflation data.
Yeah, some scary inflation data out of Nigeria, Charles. Inflation at an annual rate of 21.5%, up from 21.1%, and certainly that does mean that it's well above the CBN's target of 9%, and it does suggest that they may have to look at raising interest rates when they next meet. And of course, that's right. They'll meet in January. That's right before an election in February. So it's a little bit of a dicey time to raise rates. Most troubling thing about the Nigerian inflation data is food price inflation, rising at 24% a year. Inflation is continuing to rise in Nigeria because food prices make up so much a bigger percentage of the inflation basket in Nigeria than food does in more developed nations.
Laurie, thanks very much indeed. I was hoping you'd have mentioned the Fed there, but sadly we're out of time. But Laurie, thank you as ever. Laurie Laird, Arise Business correspondent, talking to me from London.